All right, welcome to your deep dive into Sartre. Today we're taking on Being and Nothingness, and we're starting with part one.
Oh, yes, part one.
Now, I've got to admit, it can be a bit dense at times,
Oh, absolutely.
but we're here to, unpack it all, make it a little less intimidating.
Right, like we're going to give you the Spark Notes version, but hopefully like a really engaging Spark Notes version.
Yeah, exactly. So we got a bunch of your sources here, articles, essays, even some forum discussions, it looks like.
Yeah, good mix.
Really shows how Sartre's idea that are still, relevant today. People are still debating them, trying to figure them out.
Oh, for sure.
So our mission, if you will, is to kind of distill all of that down, find the core of what Sartre's getting at in this first part of the book.
Sounds good.
Awesome. Now, I think a good place to start would be with Sartre's method itself, phenomenology.
Yeah, I think that's crucial because it's not just about like understanding the content of his ideas, but also the way he arrives at those ideas.
Right. The how is as important as the what.
Exactly. So phenomenology, in a nutshell, is about focusing on our direct experience. It's about setting aside our assumptions and preconceptions and really trying to see things as they appear to our consciousness.
So it's like instead of just going on autopilot, we're actually paying attention, like really paying attention.
Exactly. It's like hitting a refresh button on our perception.
Refresh. Okay, I like that. But I got to admit, that still sounds a bit, I don't know, abstract. Can you give me an example? Like, how would I actually do phenomenology in my everyday life?
Sure. Let's say you're looking at, I don't know, a coffee cup.
Okay, a coffee cup.
Yeah. Now, normally you might just see it as, a container for your coffee. But with phenomenology, you try to describe your experience of it without those preconceived notions.
So, like, not coffee cup, but like...
The smoothness of the ceramic, the weight of it in your hand, the warmth of the coffee, the aroma.
So it's about stripping away those labels and just focusing on the raw sensation.
Precisely. And Sartre believed that by doing this, we can gain a deeper understanding of, well, everything, really, but particularly of these big concepts like being.
Okay, being... Now, there's a word that gets thrown around a lot in philosophy. What exactly did Sartre mean by it?
Well, he's not talking about any specific thing. He's talking about the most fundamental fact of existence, right? The sheer isness of things.
So, like, everything that exists has being.
Exactly. Everything from a rock to a tree to that coffee cup we were just talking about.
Right, right. So being is just everything.
It's tempting to leave it at that, but Sartre adds an interesting wrinkle. He describes being as de trop.
De trop. Now my French is a little rusty.
It means like too much or superfluous.
Too much. How can existence itself be too much?
Well, because for Sartre, being simply is. It doesn't have a reason or a purpose. It just exists.
So it's not like there's some grand plan behind it all, some ultimate goal.
Not for Sartre, no. He sees being as this brute fact that we just encounter.
Huh, okay. It just is.
Yeah, and that leads us to his concept of nothingness, which might seem like a total 180, but it's actually closely connected.
Okay, so we go from being, which is everything, to nothingness, which is, well, nothing. My head's already starting to spin.
Haha, I know, it's a lot to take in. But nothingness for Sartre isn't just the absence of being. He sees it as a real presence, a kind of void or gap that's actually created by consciousness.
Wait, hold on. Consciousness creates nothingness. How does that work?
Well, think about it this way. You're listening to this deep dive because you're interested in learning about Sartre.
Right.
But
right.
before you started listening, you had questions. There were things you didn't know, gaps in your understanding. That lack of knowledge, that space waiting to be filled, that's a form of nothingness.
So it's like the very act of wanting to know something, of recognizing that we don't know something, that introduces nothingness.
Exactly. And this points to another key idea for Sartre. Consciousness isn't just a passive container for thoughts. It's an active force, always directed outwards towards the world.
So instead of consciousness being like a bowl filled with ideas, it's more like...
It's more like a spotlight.
What spotlight?
Yeah, it's always shining on something, illuminating objects, feelings, thoughts, but it's intentional, always reaching out, trying to grasp something beyond itself.
So our consciousness isn't just observing the world, it's actively engaging with it.
Precisely. And what's unique about human consciousness is that it can also turn that spotlight inwards. We're not just conscious, we're conscious of being conscious.
Whoa, that is a mind bender. To be aware of your own awareness.
Right, and that ties back into the idea of nothingness, because if consciousness is always reaching for something beyond itself, it suggests a kind of lack, a gap that needs to be filled.
So if being just is, and consciousness is always striving, Where does that leave us?
Well, that's where things start to get really existential, and that's what we'll be exploring in the next part of this deep dive when we talk about being for itself.
Okay, being for itself.
It's Sartre's term for human consciousness, and it gets to the heart of what makes us, well, us.
All right, I am intrigued, but first, maybe we can all take a moment to, like, process all of this.
Sounds like a good plan.
Yeah, we'll be back in a moment to delve deeper into Sartre's Being and Nothingness. Okay, so we're back and ready to dive back into Sartre.
All right, let's do it.
Now, before the break, we were talking about consciousness as this, like, active force, always reaching beyond itself. And you mentioned this term, being for itself.
Right, being for itself. This is how Sartre describes human consciousness.
Okay, so how does that differ from just regular being? You know, the being we were talking about before.
Yeah, good question. Remember how we said being is just this raw, like, existence? That rock, that tree they just are, Sartre calls that being in itself.
Being in itself. So, like, no fuss, no striving, just pure existence.
Exactly, but being for itself is different. It's characterized by awareness, awareness of being.
Okay, I think I see where you're going with this. Like, I can look at that tree and think about how long it's been existing. But the tree itself isn't, like, contemplating its own existence.
Precisely. Being for itself is self-aware. It's conscious of its own being.
So we humans, we're not just being. We're aware that we are being.
Right, and that awareness, that ability to reflect on ourselves and the world around us, that's what creates this fundamental difference between being for itself and being in itself.
So there's like a gap between the two.
Yeah, there's a gap. And Sartre says that being for itself is defined by its lack.
It's lack. I don't quite follow.
It means that being for itself is constantly aware of what it is not. It's not just simply existing like that rock. It's striving, yearning, reaching for something more.
It's like we're always aware that there's something else out there, something we don't have, something we haven't achieved. It's that feeling of like always reaching for something just beyond our grasp.
That's a good way to put it. And for Sartre, this lack isn't a bad thing. It's actually the source of our freedom.
Wait, hold on. How can a lack of something equal freedom?
Think of it this way. If we were just being in itself, just existing without self-awareness, we would be totally determined by our nature. Like, imagine a rock rolling down a hill. It has no choice but to follow the laws of physics.
Okay, yeah, I see that.
But because we're being for itself, because we can question and we can choose, we're not bound by those same limitations.
So our ability to imagine different possibilities, to think about ourselves as not being what we currently are, that's what makes us free.
Exactly. And that freedom is, well, it's both exhilarating and terrifying.
Oh yeah, I can see that. Because if we're always choosing, always defining ourselves with each choice, it's a lot of pressure, isn't it?
It is. Sartre called it the anguish of freedom. He said we are, in a sense, condemned to be free.
Condemned to be free, that's heavy.
It is, but it also means that we have the power to create our own meaning, to shape our own destinies.
So we're not just free to choose our actions, but also like how we interpret the world, how we see ourselves.
Exactly. Sartre believed that we project our own values and meanings onto the world. There's no inherent meaning out there waiting to be discovered.
We're the ones creating it through our choices, our interpretations of our actions.
Precisely. And that ties back into what we were saying about nothingness being created by consciousness. Because if the world doesn't have inherent meaning, then our consciousness is always striving to fill that void, to like impose order and significance on a reality that's ultimately just this raw, unexplained existence.
So how do we deal with that, knowing that there's this lack, this nothingness at the heart of everything?
It's not easy. Sartre talked about anguish as being a part of the human condition. It's that feeling of unease that comes with knowing that our choices have real consequences, that we're responsible for creating our own meaning.
So like we can't just ignore it, pretend it's not there.
Well, Sartre said many people try to do just that. He called it bad faith. It's a kind of self-deception where we convince ourselves that we're not truly free.
So it's like trying to escape the responsibility of freedom.
Exactly, trying to avoid that anxiety, that anguish. But Sartre believed that authentic existence requires us to confront our freedom.
To own it, so to speak.
Yeah, to embrace the responsibility that comes with it, to accept that we are the authors of our own lives.
Okay, so just to recap, we've got being for itself, always striving, always reaching for something beyond itself. We've got this lack, this nothingness that we're constantly trying to fill. And we've got bad faith as this tempting, but ultimately inauthentic way of escaping the anxiety of freedom.
Right.
Is there anything else we need to know about how Sartre saw this whole dynamic?
Yes, one more thing. Sartre argued that consciousness isn't just a lack, it's also a project.
A
It
project.
means that our consciousness is always directed towards the future. We're constantly setting goals, imagining possibilities, striving to become something more than what we are right now.
Even though we know we're finite, we're still driven to, like, create and evolve.
Exactly. And that, for Sartre, is the ultimate expression of our freedom. We're not just passively reacting to the world, we're actively shaping it, projecting ourselves into the future, becoming.
I see. So this lack, this nothingness, it's not just a void to be feared. It's actually what drives our creativity, our freedom, our very humanity.
That's a great way to put it. And it lays the groundwork for understanding Sartre's views on how we relate to others, which is where we'll be heading next.
Okay, bring on the other. But maybe we could take a quick break first.
Sounds good.
We'll be right back with more Sartre. Okay, so we've talked about being, we've talked about nothingness, we've talked about consciousness and freedom and bad faith. But there's one piece of the puzzle we haven't really explored yet.
Yeah, we've been focusing on the individual so far, like how we experience the world as individuals.
Right, but like we don't exist in a vacuum, do we?
Exactly, and that's where other people come in. This is where Sartre shifts his focus to the interpersonal.
Okay, so how do other people fit into this whole being and nothingness thing?
Well, Sartre believed that our interactions with others are fundamental to how we experience our own being. He even came up with a term for it, being for others.
Being for others. Okay, so we're not just solitary beings creating meaning in a vacuum. Other people actually play a role in how we see ourselves.
Absolutely. Sartre argued that it's through the eyes of others that we first come to understand ourselves as like distinct beings, separate from the world around us.
So it's not just about like feeling self-conscious in front of other people. It's actually about the very formation of our identity.
Right. But it's not always a straight current process. Sartre said this experience of being seen by others, he called it the look, can also be a source of conflict and alienation.
The look. That sounds kind of intense.
Yeah, it can be. Because when someone looks at us, they inevitably objectify us. Even if it's unintentional, they reduce us to a set of observable traits, like our appearance or our behavior.
And that can feel, I don't know, kind of threatening. Like it limits our freedom.
Exactly. It can feel like we're being defined by that gaze, by that external perception, and that can clash with how we see ourselves.
This reminds me of bad faith. Is it possible to like fall into bad faith in our relationships with others?
Oh, definitely. Sartre said we often trying to escape the anxiety of the look by, conforming to social expectations, by playing roles that we think will make us more acceptable.
So instead of being authentic, we're just trying to manage other people's perceptions of us.
Right. And that ultimately denies our own freedom.
Okay, so how do we avoid that trap? How do we navigate all this being for others stuff without falling into bad faith?
Well, Sartre believed that authentic relationships require mutual recognition.
Mutual recognition.
Yeah, it's about recognizing the other person as a free subject, just like ourselves, not trying to objectify them or control them or reduce them to a role.
That sounds pretty challenging, especially in a world where we're constantly being told how we should look and act.
It's definitely a challenge, but Sartre saw it as a worthwhile one because he believed that authentic relationships can help us overcome that sense of alienation and nothingness that can permeate our existence.
So by like really seeing each other, recognizing each other's freedom, we can actually create meaning and connection.
Exactly, and I think that's a really powerful idea, that even though Sartre's philosophy can seem pretty bleak at times, he does offer a glimmer of hope.
Yeah, it's not all doom and gloom. There's this potential for genuine connection, for finding meaning through our relationships with others.
Right.
Well, I think that's a great place to wrap things up. We've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive into Sartre.
We have. It's been quite a journey.
And even though like we've only scratched the surface of being and nothingness, I feel like we've given our listeners some good tools to keep exploring on their own.
I hope so.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into Sartre. And we'll see you next time for another exploration of the world of ideas.